Good morning. Welcome to Political Science 201. I'm Laura Fleming. We are getting ready for our second unit in the course, which is going to be about the legislative and executive branches. We're going to start with the legislative branch. This is the branch of government that's most representative. It's the branch that the founders felt was important enough that they began the Constitution, Article 1, with a description of Congress. So today we're going to talk about how Congress works. We're going to start with the House of Representatives. We're going to talk a little bit about the districts that comprise the House of Representatives and how they're drawn. And then we'll talk about the Senate as well, how the Senate operates. That's the overview for today's lecture. Think back maybe on your high school civics class and think about what are some differences between senators and the members of the House of Representatives. So maybe you know that there are fewer senators. We talked about some of this last week. We talked about the fact that the Senate represents the states as states, so they're represented equally in Congress, whereas the House of Representatives represents by population. It's a much larger body. Maybe you know that senators have a longer term, so they serve for 6 years. Members of the House only serve for 2 years. There are also different requirements to run for Senate and to run for a seat in the House of Representatives, so we're going to talk about that as well. Hopefully we'll get to do a deeper dive and explore why did the founders put these differences in the two different chambers of Congress. Congress gets a bad rap. People like to complain about Congress. It generally has a pretty low approval rating. So this is a graph of the approval rating of Congress. You can see that generally it's pretty low, definitely below 50%. More recently, it's been hovering in the teens there. So just a small percentage of people actually approve of Congress, think they're doing a great job. They have this reputation for being dysfunctional, not being able to get things done. We'll talk about that. You can see that in 2001 there was a spike and people actually did feel pretty good about Congress for a brief period of time. That spike, of course, was in the aftermath of the 9/11 terror attacks. So people were feeling patriotic. People were looking to Congress for solutions, for help, and actually people felt that Congress pulled together and demonstrated solidarity and got things done in the aftermath of that crisis. But then pretty rapidly the approval level for Congress went back down again. I'm going to give you some reasons to have a little bit brighter view of Congress. Okay, and I'm getting these reasons from a guy named Lee Hamilton. Lee Hamilton is a former representative from Indiana. So he served in the House of Representatives. He was a Democrat from the 1960s all the way through the late 1990s. So he was in Congress for a long time, and he's kind of an apologist for Congress. He talks about why Congress actually is important and why Congress deserves our respect. The first thing that Lee Hamilton says is that Congress is the most representative branch of government. This is one of its great strengths. He says Congress is by far the most representative institution in the United States. We live in a complicated country of vast size and remarkable diversity. Our people are many, they're spread far and wide, and they represent a great variety of beliefs, religions, and ethnicities. It isn't easy for such a country to live together peacefully and productively. It's true Congress does not perfectly mirror the demographics of the American people. We'll talk about that. So it's not like Congress is a perfect reflection of the country's diversity, but it does help bind us together by representing our country. And when you think about it, the 9 members of the Supreme Court are not super representative, even though we do have an African American justice, Justice Thomas, we have a Latina justice, Justice Sotomayor, but in reality, the 9 justices on the Supreme Court are all graduates pretty much of Harvard or Yale law schools. That's not super representative of the people. If you look at the president's just one person, so how representative can he be, right? But Congress has representatives from every district in the United States, every state, every district, and it really is the most representative form of government that we have, the most representative institution that we have in the national government. The second thing I'd like you to remember is that Congress is the most accessible branch. This is from Lee Hamilton again. He says Congress is much more accessible than any other part of the national government. Congress is the primary listening post of the people. If an ordinary American has a complaint or suggestion about the government, good luck reaching the president or the vice president or a cabinet secretary or even a deputy assistant secretary, but you can reach your representative or senator. We'll talk more about this, but the fact is that every representative in Congress, every senator has an office dedicated to public outreach, and they actually encourage you to go on their websites, fill out the forms, email them, contact them. If you give them enough advance notice, sometimes you can even meet with your member of Congress, either in Washington, D.C., or when they're home in your state or in your district. And I've spoken with a former member of Congress, Rodney Alexander. He used to represent the 5th District here in Louisiana, and he said that anytime somebody took the time to write him a handwritten letter, he said that he always read that. So I know that's a little archaic, actually using snail mail and writing handwritten letters, but that is one way to get your member of Congress to pay attention, so it doesn't just look like a form letter you copied and pasted off the internet. So, in terms of all the different institutions in our national government, Congress for sure is most accessible, and they pride themselves on being available to the voters. Finally, Congress is the most deliberative branch. Hamilton says it's our nation's chief deliberative body, the place where the many views and interests of the American people on all manner of subjects get thrashed out. It remains the central forum for vigorous public debate, consensus building, and decision making on the most important issues of the day. Sometimes we'll talk about this. We get frustrated because Congress is always arguing and discussing and debating, but actually, this is a very important part of its function. We'll talk about the fact that we don't want Congress to just impose its will on the American people. We want there to be some consensus, some discussion, debate, and resolution so that the laws that actually get passed are the best ones. I want to read to you from the textbook. The textbook puts a high value on diversity. And here's a textbook lamenting the lack of diversity in Congress. It says, Congress is not now and never has been a cross-section of the American population. Despite the progress made since the earliest Congresses, the citizens who serve are still disproportionately white and male. women, who make up 51% of the nation's populations, are particularly underrepresented at just 17%. So the good news is the textbook was written several cycles ago, several election cycles ago, and diversity in Congress is actually increasing. But even the textbook has this little blurb here. It has a picture of Representatives Linda Sanchez and Loretta Sanchez being sworn in, both Democrats from Southern California. They are the first sisters in Congress. So even at the time the textbook was written, you had two Latina sisters in Congress. Not only that, the textbook says Linda was also the first unmarried pregnant member of Congress. I don't know whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it does show that Congress is very representative and fairly diverse. Now, the founders actually did struggle with this question: how diverse should Congress be? Now, we know, again, we're trying to judge the founders by the standard of their times. We don't want to be guilty of presentism, of judging the founders by today's standards. We know that they were not that interested in sex diversity or race diversity, but they did know that there was not diversity of occupation in Congress, that Congress tended to be made up of people from the same occupations, usually business people and lawyers. And so the question is a Congress that's made up of business people and lawyers, is that really representative? What about all of the blue-collar workers, etc.? And this is from Essay 35. Hamilton says, the idea of an actual representation of all classes of the people by persons of each class is altogether visionary. What he means, it's altogether, hypothetical. Unless it were expressly provided in the Constitution that each different occupation would send one or more members, the thing would never take place in practice. So he says, how are you going to do this? How are you going to achieve exact diversity of occupation in Congress? You'd have to have quotas, right? Do we really want to have quotas? He says, it is said to be necessary all classes of citizens should have some of their own number in the representative body in order that their feelings and interests may be the better understood and attended to. So people were saying, really, you have to have people from each group represented in Congress to tend to their interests. But Hamilton says, I disagree. Number one, this will never happen under any arrangement that leaves the votes of the people free. People have to be free to vote for who they want to vote for without worrying about whether a member of Congress is from a specific group or not. And he says, not only that, people in Congress are candidates for the favor of the people. They're dependent on the votes of their fellow citizens for the continuance of their public honors. And is it not natural they should take care to inform themselves of the dispositions of the voters and inclinations, and should be willing to allow them their proper degree of influence upon their conduct? So Hamilton says we don't need quotas. We don't need exact one-to-one representation of the different groups. He was talking about occupational groups, but you can extrapolate. Hamilton was saying, we don't need that exact one-to-one mirroring or diversity because, number one, if you have quotas, that doesn't leave the people free to vote for the candidate that they choose. And number two, the actual fact of voting will cause the representatives, no matter what occupation they're in, to listen to the voters, no matter what occupation they're in. So it would not be smart for a lawyer in Congress to only listen to his voters who were lawyers, because there are fewer lawyers than any other occupations, and eventually that member of Congress, according to Hamilton, would get voted out. Okay, so we don't necessarily need, at least according to the founders, you don't need one-to-one representation of each group in society to have a representative system that is sensitive to and influenced by the will of the voting population. Nonetheless, diversity, if we're talking about racial diversity, ethnic diversity, gender diversity, diversity in Congress is definitely increasing. Okay, and we'll talk about that. These are some of the members of Congress I would like to introduce you to. Here we have, in this picture up in the top left, we have a group of young women Congress people that were voted into office in the prior cycle. Okay, so we're talking about 2018. Starting from the left, we have the famous or infamous AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, representing New York's 14th district, the youngest woman ever elected to Congress. Then we have Massachusetts Representative Ayanna Pressley, the first African-American woman to ever represent Massachusetts in Congress. You have Ilhan Omar here from Minnesota, the first Somali American elected to Congress, one of the first two Muslim women elected to serve in Capitol Hill. Here you have Deb Haaland from New Mexico, one of the first two Native American women elected to Congress, a member of the Laguna Pueblo people. And next to her we have Veronica Escobar. She represents Texas's 16th district, one of the first two Latinas to represent Texas in Congress. Finally, on the right here, you have Sharice Davids from Kansas, one of the first two Native American women elected to Congress. She is a lesbian, a member of the LGBTQ community from Kansas, also a professional mixed martial arts artist. So don't mess with Sharice Davids. And you can see these women, they went and had this very nice photo shoot here for one of the high fashion magazines. Now, these are all Democrat women. Republicans have gotten a bad rap for not taking care of women and minorities and their representation the way they should. Nonetheless, I'd like to introduce you to two Republican women in Congress. Here is Joni Ernst. She's a senator from Iowa. And if you click on her photo, I'm sorry I can't do that for you here. If you click on your photo, you'll get a very interesting campaign ad. Okay, it's the best opening line of any campaign ad. She says, I'm Joni Ernst. I grew up castrating hogs on an Iowa farm. Okay, so that's very interesting. Here is Mia Love. She's a former representative from Utah, black woman representing Utah. If you click on her picture, you can view her campaign ad as well. It's very interesting. Her campaign ad features an old farmer with a pickup truck trying to keep a guy in a suit from Washington from messing with his truck, right? And the hashtag is get away from my truck. Okay, so the idea is that we don't need the bureaucrats from Washington interfering with our health care. She was trying to make a metaphor there. So what's very interesting, you can see, is that we don't just have a diversity of gender or diversity of race. We also have a diversity of region where the Democrats tend to be more urbane, more fashionable, more city folk. And here you have the Republican women emphasizing the rural aspect of our nation. If you click on those two campaign ads and Joni Ernst's ad, you'll hear the pigs grunting. With Mia Love's ad, you'll hear the cows in the background. They're both wearing plaid, right? And so the idea is they're representing the more rural voters. Okay, so I would just leave you with this thought that even though Congress is not a perfect one-to-one mirror of the American population, I'm not sure that's a sustainable goal anyway, and the good news is that diversity is absolutely increasing. So the most recent election was in November 2018. Obviously, we have an election coming up in November 2020, so that's very exciting. We are currently in the 116th Congress, okay? And the 116th Congress is serving from January 2019 through the end of 2020. And then in November, we're going to elect a new Congress, the 117th Congress, and they're going to serve from 2021 to 2022. Please turn with me to the U.S. Constitution. That's found on page 96 of your accessible Federalist. You'll see there's a little preamble there, and then it jumps right in with Article 1. Next to Article 1, you can write Congress. Okay, this is the first article of the Constitution, and the founders believed this was the most important, the representative branch of our new federal government. Article 1, Section 1 says, all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and the House of Representatives. Okay, and then it goes on to describe the differences between the House and the Senate. Article 1, Section 2 says the House of Representatives shall be composed of members chosen every second year by the people of the several states. So we see that the House has always been chosen by the people, so directly elected by the people for a term of 2 years. If you go on in Article 1, Section 2, it talks about the qualifications for a member of the House of Representatives. No person shall be a representative who shall not have attained to the age of 25 years and been 7 years a citizen of the United States. So the minimum age is 25. Minimum length of citizenship is 7 years. The question is, how many members do we have in the House of Representatives? So House of Representatives originally grew as the population grew. So it started out with about 59 representatives. By 1929, the House of Representatives was pretty large, 435 members, and it was getting, harder and harder to keep things organized. And they said, okay, I think we better stop while we're still ahead. So the number of members in the House of Representatives has been capped at 435 since about 1929. Okay, let's take a look at Article 1, Section 3, which discusses the Senate. It says, the Senate of the United States shall be composed of 2 senators from each state, chosen by the legislature thereof for 6 years. Okay, this is very interesting. We see that originally senators were chosen by state legislators. Okay, so because senators were supposed to represent the states as states, state legislatures were allowed to simply choose their senators. We saw that during the progressive era, the progressives were trying to consolidate all of these different levels of government. They were trying to emphasize the link between the people and their national government directly. And so the 17th Amendment changed that. They kind of bypassed state legislatures and they said, okay, we want the people to elect senators directly, just like they do members of the House. Let's take a look at the qualifications for senators, which is also part of Article 1, Section 3. Okay, again, in terms of the term, senators have a longer term in office, 6 years. And if you look carefully at Article 1, Section 3, you can see that the senators are divided up into 3 different classes, and the terms are staggered. So what this means is that we have elections every 2 years, because that's the term for members of the House. So every 2 years we elect members of the House of Representatives, and every 2 years we elect 1/3 of the Senate. Okay, so they don't have all of the senators standing for re-election at the same time. You can only re-elect 1/3 of the Senate every 6 years because it's staggered. And we'll talk more about why it's that way. Okay, qualifications for senators. No person shall be a senator who shall not have attained to the age of 30 years and been 9 years a citizen of the United States. So here we see the age for senators is longer, 30 years, and the minimum length of citizenship is also longer, 9 years instead of 7. And there's a reason for this difference that we'll talk about. Finally, if you're wondering how many senators are there in Congress, there are 2 per state, which gives us 100 senators, quite a bit smaller group than the House of Representatives. Now, the interesting thing is that even though the House has 2-year terms, the Senate has 6-year terms, there are no term limits. So this means that members of the House and members of the Senate can be re-elected over and over and over again for decades, and this happens quite often, actually. I'd like to turn your attention to Federalist Essay 62. You can find this at page 51 of your accessible Federalist. This is James Madison talking about why we have a separate Senate. He starts out acknowledging the qualifications proposed for senators. This is on page 51. He notes that a senator must be 30 years of age at least. A representative in the House must be 25. A senator must have been a citizen for 9 years, and a representative in the House only 7 years. He says the need for these differences is explained by the particular function of the Senate. In the original Federalist Essay 62, that phrase is the senatorial trust. I want you to remember that, the senatorial trust. There are certain duties, 3 specific duties that we'll talk about that the Senate performs that the House of Representatives does not. And Madison says these duties require in its members greater extent of information and stability of character, qualities which require in turn that the senator should have reached a time of life most likely to supply them. So sorry guys, according to Madison, to be a senator, to execute the senatorial trust, you have to be older, you have to be wiser, and therefore you have to be at least 30. Okay, once you hit the age of 30, according to the founders, then you would be at the time of life where you'd be most able to bear the responsibility of the senatorial trust. Madison goes on, looking at page 52. He says, yeah, I know that we have a Senate because of political compromise. So remember, to get both the larger states and the smaller states on board, we had to have these 2 chambers in Congress. But Madison says it wasn't just the product of negotiation. It wasn't just expediency. He says the Senate presents an additional obstacle against unfair legislation. This is the bottom of page 52. No law or resolution can now be passed without the agreement of both the majority of the people and a majority of the states. So a majority of the people by population in the House and a majority of the states as states in the Senate are required to pass any laws. And Madison says this is a check against unfair legislation. This will screen out legislation that's unfair for one reason or another. He says, I admit this complicated check on legislation may in some cases be harmful as well as beneficial. So he says, I understand sometimes having two chambers in Congress could potentially screen out good laws. Nonetheless, he says the ease and excess of lawmaking seem to be the usual faults of our governments. When you have a representative government, a government of the people, the problem generally is not too few laws. The problem generally is it's too easy to make laws and there are too many of them. And Madison says, you know, it's all going to work out here if we have this additional roadblock to legislation. Madison goes on and he says, secondly, now we're on page 53, necessity of a Senate is also suggested by the tendency of all single and numerous legislative assemblies to give in to the impulse of sudden and violent passions. So he's saying if you only have one legislative body and if it's very large and draws from a broad segment of the population, it's likely to get stirred up by passions and fads. Okay, and he goes on and he says we need a less numerous body, so the Senate has fewer members than the House, that possesses greater firmness and should hold its authority for a considerably longer term. So in other words, he sees the Senate as a force of restraint and a force for stability. Going on to page 54, we read a frequent change, even of good measures, is both imprudent and counterproductive. So Madison's worried. We have this great body in the legislature, the House of Representatives. It's a large group of people. And they're, reelected every 2 years, but would that lead to a lack of stability and too much change? So that's why we have a Senate. Moving on to page 55, he says the internal effects of frequently changing policy are disastrous. It poisons the blessing of liberty itself. So he says, even if you're a free country, if your policies are always changing, you're going to hurt yourself. It will be of little use to the people that the laws are made by men of their own choice. If the laws are so lengthy they cannot be read, or so incoherent they cannot be understood, if they are repealed or revised before they are made known, or undergo such frequent changes that no one who knows what the law is today can guess what it will be tomorrow. He says, who cares if we have a representative form of government if the laws are always changing and we have this instability in our legislation. He goes on, gives some examples. What prudent merchant will risk his wealth in any new branch of commerce when he doesn't know if his plans will be made unlawful before they can be carried out? What farmer or manufacturer will exert himself due to the encouragement given to any particular crop or business when he has no guarantee his work and progress will not fall victim to an unstable government? He says, in short, no great improvement or admirable enterprise can move forward which requires an environment of stable public policy. So again, business people, farmers, manufacturers, they're going to be reluctant to make investments and to start new ventures if they're concerned about the stability of the laws. And therefore, the Senate being older and wiser and less likely to turn over because, you're only voting for a third of the Senate at a time and they have 6-year terms. So older, wiser, less susceptible to change, they can be a block on legislation that would change too quickly. Madison ends Federalist 62 by saying no government can be truly respectable without having a certain amount of order and stability. So there you have Federalist 62, which is Madison's defense of the separate Senate. So you may be asking the question, why? Okay, why did the founders create these two chambers in Congress, and they have all these differences? Did they just do that to make it more difficult when I'm trying to take the quiz or the test for political science class? And the answer is no, there is a point. The differences between the House and the Senate do have a purpose. We talked about some of that with Federalist 62. So let's take a look at some of the other essays. These essays have not been translated. They're not in your accessible Federalist, so I'm going to be reading from the original here. Federalist 52. Okay, why do we have the House? What are the peculiar functions of the House? Here's Madison. He says, a representative of the United States, so a member of the House, must be 25, must be 7 years a citizen, etc. Under these reasonable limitations, the door of this part of the federal government is open to merit of every description, native or adoptive, young or old, without regard to poverty or wealth or to any particular profession of religious faith. So basically, all you have to do is make it to 25. If you can make it to 25, be a citizen for 7 years, you too can run as a member of the House of Representatives. And the House has a special function. He says the House is meant to be the immediate representatives of the people. He says it's essential that the House of Representatives have an immediate dependence on and an intimate sympathy with the people. And how do we achieve that? How do we get members of the House to listen so carefully to the people? Frequent elections, the 2-year terms. Frequent elections are unquestionably the only policy by which this dependence and sympathy can be effectually secured. The House is going to be very carefully listening to the people because they know they're going to be up for re-election shortly. They have that dependence on the people. In addition, there's some concern that the Senate, as this older, wiser, more stable body that's in office longer, will become elite and out of touch and aristocratic. And the founder said, don't worry, we're not worried about that, because just like the Senate checks the House also checks the Senate. This is from Federalist Essay 63. So here Madison says, the federal Senate will never be able to transform itself by gradual usurpations into an independent and aristocratic body. That's not going to happen. Why isn't it going to happen? Because of the force of the immediate representatives of the people, the members of the House of Representatives. They will be able to bring the Senate back to its senses and force the Senate to listen to the people. Okay, so the House prevents the Senate from getting too out of touch. Now, we've already talked about the fact that the Senate provides a sense of stability, that the Senate has special functions called the senatorial trust that we'll talk about later. In addition, the founders believed that the House perhaps would be too susceptible to fads and passions. So here's Federalist 63. He says, an institution like the Senate may sometimes be necessary as a defense to the people against their own temporary errors and delusions. He goes on, he says, there are particular moments in public affairs when the people, stimulated by some irregular passion or some illicit advantage, are misled by the artful misrepresentations of interested men. So there can be some cases where the people get caught up in an idea and may call for measures which they themselves will afterwards be the most ready to lament and condemn. Basically, sometimes a house may want things that are not good for it. In these critical moments, how salutary, how good will be the interference of some temperate and respectable body of citizens. So if somebody is wanting something that's not good for them, then it's good to have that older, wiser person interfere to suspend the blow mediated by the people against themselves until reason, justice, and truth can regain their authority over the public mind. So let's say that you've been out having a good time drinking, you're walking home, you pass by a tattoo parlor, and you think, I've always wanted to have a tattoo of Tinkerbell right on my bicep. I think that's a great idea. Okay. And let's say you have a friend who is known for being kind of a stick in the mud, and your friend says, hey, why don't we sleep on that? Let's think about that. Maybe you can, who knows if they're even open right now. Why don't we check back tomorrow? And then, in the morning you wake up and you think, I'm so glad I had that friend that kept me from getting a tattoo of Tinkerbell on my bicep last night. I was, caught up in the moment and wasn't thinking clearly. Okay, so that's the role of the Senate, to be the wet blanket of Congress. We can personalize this. Which member of your family is more like the Senate and which is like the House? So maybe you have a big sister who your parents would put in charge from time to time that was kind of mean and wouldn't let you do anything, right? That would be more like the Senate. If you're looking at your parents, maybe let's just take an example. Maybe your dad's more like the House, Maybe your dad's the fun parent. And so the kids represent the people. So let's say the kids are agitated and they want to go to Whataburger for dinner. And the dad says, yeah, that's a great idea. And why don't we go to Eskimos for dessert afterwards, right? So your dad is like the House, listening to what the people want. And then you go to your mom and your mom says, well, we've already had fast food this week and, they don't have any good salads at Whataburger, and I've already thought out the chicken to make dinner tonight, etc., etc. She's thinking about being healthy. She's thinking about saving money. And in that case, your mom would be the force for reason and prudence and stability, and she would be more like the Senate. So again, we need both sides of the equation, right? So we need people who are spontaneous and like to do fun things, and people who introduce new ideas, people who are change agents. But we also need that strong sense of stability, of prudence, of caution. So the two houses of Congress, they have these two different personalities or flavors, and actually the founders intended that these two personalities would work together so that the legislation that came out would be good legislation. All right, let's talk specifically about the House of Representatives. There are 435 representatives in the House, so approximately one representative for every 700,000 people. That is a set number. Again, like we said, it's been 435 for almost 100 years now. If you look at this map, the map is a map of the districts. There's 435 districts, and each district has one representative, and the House is 54% Democrat. So right now, the House is majority Democrat. when you look at the map, it doesn't look like the map is majority Democrat. Democrat is the blue areas and Republican is the red areas. And there sure is a lot of red there for the Democrats to have the majority. And the answer to that, of course, is that the House of Representatives is by population and not by geography. So if you look, you have these whole areas like Montana and the Dakotas, okay, whole big rural states that only have one representative. Okay, Alaska over here, one representative, and then you have the urban areas here, in the Northeast, multiple in California, coastal California, multiple districts squeezed into a small geographic area. And you can see again the phenomenon we talked about earlier, that today the rural areas tend to vote Republican, and the urban and especially coastal areas tend to vote Democrat. So you should know that the balance of power in Congress shifts back and forth. The House was majority Republican prior to the 2018 elections, and it was majority Democrat prior to the November 2012 elections. And the balance of power shifts back and forth, and it tends to shift depending on the popularity of the president. Now, we'll talk more about this later, but the president is elected every 4 years. And so every 4 years you have the presidential election, and then on the off cycle, okay, the in-between years, remember we have elections every 2 years, so every other cycle is a presidential cycle, and then the off cycle is called the midterm elections that are in the middle of the president's term. And so the way that the balance of power in Congress shifts on the midterm elections can be a signal as to how the people feel like the president is doing. So we'll talk more about that. House of Representatives is led by a position called the Speaker. Okay, so the current Speaker of the House is Nancy Pelosi. She's a Democrat from California. And, so we have a Democrat Speaker when the Democrats have the majority in the House, and then we'll have a Republican Speaker when the Republicans have the majority in the House. What's interesting is that Nancy Pelosi was the Speaker many years ago, before 2012, when the Democrats had the majority. Then the speakership shifted to the Republicans, and now it's shifted back to the Democrats and Nancy Pelosi. The current Republican leader is Kevin McCarthy, also from California. If you click on this link up at the top, then it'll take you to the U.S. House of Representatives webpage, and you can see the leadership structure in the House of Representatives. I'm not able to click that right now, but it can show you the Democrat leaders, the Republican leaders. Again, the main position you want to remember is the Speaker of the House, which is currently Nancy Pelosi. House leaders are assisted by a position called the whips. Whips are individuals, they're assistants to the House leadership. There's Democratic whips and Republican whips, and they help count the votes and whip up support for bills. You can imagine with 435 members of the House of Representatives that you really want to get your numbers straight. It takes some time when you're trying to pass a bill to talk to everybody and figure out their positions. And so the leaders in the House do have these assistant positions. What's interesting is that the Republican whip is actually from Louisiana. So it's Representative Steve Scalise. Okay, Louisiana does not have that many representatives, so it's kind of cool that we have a representative in House leadership Steve Scalise, the Republican whip. So the House of Representatives does the bulk of its work in committees. Today we have many specialized areas of law, and it's impossible for every lawmaker to be an expert in every area. So we divide up the different areas of law, and each representative serves on several different committees, and that way it's kind of a divide and conquer strategy. There are over 20 committees and 100 subcommittees in the House. And again, if you click on this link at the top, you can see all the different committees in the House, everything from agriculture to defense to homeland security. And then you can click on those links and you can see all the multiple subcommittees that belong to each committee. It's very political who gets to be on which committees. Some committees are more powerful than others. Defense is a very powerful committee. It has important responsibilities and it also handles quite a bit of money, right? So usually the committees that do important things or handle more money are the better committees to be on. And there's a lot of jockeying for who gets to serve on which committee. So this is how the House of Representatives does its work. Each committee has a chairperson, and usually that chairperson is going to be from the party, the political party that has the majority in the House. In this case, that would be the Democrats. This degree of specialization was just not anticipated by the founders. I have this kind of funny quote from Madison here. This is from Federalist Essay 53. He's talking about the first Congress. He says, the most laborious task will be the proper inauguration of the government and the primeval formation of a federal code. So he's basically saying that first Congress, they have their work cut out for them. They're going to have to come up with the very first code or book of national law. But according to Madison, improvements on the first draft will every year become both easier and fewer. So Madison naively thought that once the first Congress passed this first book of federal law, that after that, subsequent Congresses would just have to tweak it a little bit from time to time. Of course, that's not what happened. The federal government has gotten bigger and bigger with more and more and more laws to the point that we had to divide up into committees and subcommittees. Okay, here's a little mini question, a little thought question, real quick. Who are the senators and members of the House of Representatives from Louisiana? Can you name either of the two senators? Can you name any members of the House of Representatives or who the representative from your district might be? We talked about Steve Scalise, the House Whip. Can you name any of the others? Well, we're going to review that now. So Louisiana has 6 representatives in the House. These representatives were all re-elected in November 2018. Here they are from District 1, Steve Scalise, Republican. District 2, Cedric Richmond, a Democrat. District 3, Clay Higgins, a Republican. District 4, Mike Johnson, a Republican. District 5, Ralph Abraham. This is our district, Lincoln Parish. He's a Republican. District 6 is Garrett Graves. Okay, so what's interesting is Dr. Ralph Abraham. He's a really good guy. His district includes Lincoln Parish, most of Northeast Louisiana. If you click on his picture here, there's a link that will take you to his website. It's abraham.house.gov. So that's very interesting that members of the House of Representatives get their own website on the government server. And if you look, again, Abraham is from a rural district. He's Republican. He emphasizes the rural theme. So he has fields in the background, and he talks about his experiences. He is a people doctor. He's also an animal doctor, a veterinarian. In addition, he's a veteran as well. He was part of the Air Force, so very interesting guy. Now, Dr. Abraham made a promise that he would only serve 3 terms. And so, unlike many members of the House of Representatives, he didn't want to be reelected over and over and over for decades. And so he is coming to the end of his 3rd term. So that seat will be open for the 2020 election. So it'll be very interesting to see who is going to be our new representative from District 5 in 2020. We'll talk about this. It's difficult to defeat an incumbent. It's far more likely that you'll be reelected than you'll be elected for the first time. This is what happened the last election cycle. Everybody was just reelected. And so this is an opportunity for somebody new to jump in there when Ralph Abraham sort of voluntarily gave himself a term limit. Let's talk a little bit about how representatives are apportioned. Representatives are reapportioned every 10 years based on the U.S. Census. This is right from the Constitution. So you remember the House of Representatives is based on population, and population changes. How do we know how the population changes? Well, we have a census every 10 years. In fact, this is a census year. I actually got paperwork for the census in the mail that I need to go ahead and go online and fill out. Maybe some of you did as well. So depending on the results of the 2020 census, the representatives in the House will be reapportioned. So take a look. This is the apportionment from the last cycle in 2010. Remember, it's a zero-sum game. There's only 435 representatives. So states can lose or gain representatives based on population change. If you look at this map, as a result of the 2010 census, Texas was the big winner. Texas gained 4 seats in the House. These other blue states gained a seat or 2. Louisiana lost a representative. Can you think of why? Why might Louisiana have lost a representative in the 2010 census? If you think about the events that took place between 2000 and 2010, you realize, Hurricane Katrina, okay, that was a big event. It happened in the New Orleans area, took out a large population center. Many people moved to Texas after Hurricane Katrina. You had refugees from Louisiana moving to other states. That's not the whole reason that Texas gained 4 seats in the House, but that might be part of it, and that certainly might be part of the reason that Louisiana lost a representative after the 2010 census. So it was like a game of musical chairs. After the 2010 census, Louisiana had to redraw its districts. So you see over here on the left that there used to be 7 districts. Okay, so District 7 included Lake Charles and Lafayette. So there were 7 members in the House of Representatives. All of a sudden, now you only had 6 seats, and so they had to redraw, reapportion these districts. And if you look at the right-hand side, this new map here, they've eliminated District 7. They've shifted District 3 to the west. District 5, our district, has gained a little bit of territory there. And what's really interesting is District 2. District 2 is a quote-unquote majority-minority district. It contains urban areas like New Orleans and Baton Rouge, really the two major urban areas in Louisiana. You'll remember that District 2 is the only district that has a Democrat representative. Okay, this fits with what we've seen, the trend, which is for Republicans to represent the more rural districts and Democrats to represent the more urban populated districts. So they actually drew District 2 in such a way as to preserve its minority character. Let's talk a little bit about gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is a name for this process of drawing districts where the suspicion is that the districts are based on political lines. So what happens is people don't live in a nice uniform distribution across the state. You can't just put a piece of graph paper over the state and carve out little boxes for the districts. People live in neighborhoods. Some are more densely populated than others, and so the districts are not going to be uniform in their boundaries. For this reason, this process of drawing districts is subject to political manipulation. This is something that's been going on for a long time. In fact, the word gerrymander comes from the governor of Massachusetts back in the early 1800s, Governor Elbridge Gerry. And the idea, the accusation was that Governor Gerry and his legislature had drawn these districts to favor Thomas Jefferson's political party over against Alexander Hamilton's political party. It was a caricature. They said it looked like some kind of salamander, and so they took Governor Gerry's last name and slapped it on there and called it a gerrymander. Basically, gerrymandering is part of the political process. It's been with us. It'll likely continue to be with us. There are some positives to gerrymanders. What they can do is they can give a district a uniform voice. So for example, you do have majority-minority districts like District 2 in Louisiana, and the argument is that through the use of the gerrymander, you're giving the minority residents in that district the ability to have at least one representative. It also allows the state legislatures to influence national elections. Remember, before the Progressive era and the 17th Amendment, state legislatures basically chose senators. They can't do that anymore, but they can have this indirect influence on members of the House of Representatives in the way that districts are drawn. So let's take a very simple example. Okay, remember, this is very oversimplified because again, people don't live in nice, neat graphs, but even if they did, you could figure out a way to gerrymander. Let's say that you have two political parties, the X party and the Y party, and you have 3 congressional seats, and so you're trying to draw the districts. Now, one way to draw the districts would be in this manner. Let's say you have these 3 districts, and you can see that 2 districts are majority X, and you would assume that a politician from party X would be the representative, and then you have that 1 district at the bottom that's majority Y, and you would assume that a politician from party Y would represent that district. And overall, you can see that there are a higher percentage of X's than Y's in total. Now, there's another way that you could draw the districts. If you were a politician from party Y and you wanted to maximize your influence, what you could do is you could stuff all of the X's in 1 district like that, and then draw a 2nd district like this, and you could keep that final district at the bottom there, lo and behold, the outcome is quite different. So now you have two districts that are majority Y. You would have two politicians from Party Y in Congress, and only one district that is majority X. So even though X is the majority party overall, you can have more politicians from Party Y in Congress. So you can see what gerrymandering, it has some possibilities for manipulation for sure. Somebody went through and tried to pick out the top 10 gerrymanders, the districts that they felt had been, twisted and contorted the most. And really it's a toss-up as to whether gerrymanders hurt or help political minorities. So you could ask, okay, maybe the second district is a safe seat for minorities, giving them a unified voice. Or is it stacking the minority vote in one district, thereby diluting its power in the other districts? It's an open question. There's also some evidence that if you force the gerrymander too hard, that you're spreading your party very thin across the districts, and it would be that much easier for the opposing party to gain the lead if your party has only a very fragile hold over multiple districts. So, there is some evidence that gerrymandering is self-correcting. It's also subject to the political process, and if you feel that a gerrymander is really unfair, you can file a lawsuit. So there has been some court involvement in toning down some of these extreme gerrymanders. Okay, so gerrymandering, kind of a dirty word. I see it more as a fact of life and part of politics that's been with us for a very long time. Let's talk about the Senate. There are 100 senators. As we discussed, the elections are staggered, so 1/3 of the seats stand for election every 2 years. Now, if you look at the Senate, which is very interesting, is majority Republican, 53% Republican. So we have a divided Congress now. The House of Representatives is majority Democrat, the Senate is majority Republican. If you look at the map, you can see, again, you can see the red states. Those states have 2 Republican senators. The blue states, of course, have 2 Democrat senators. And then you'll see these purple states. The purple states, obviously, have 1 of each, 1 Democrat and 1 Republican senator. Because, again, the elections are staggered, so it's possible for a state to be feeling more Democratic in one election cycle and more Republican in another election cycle. You'll see here Vermont and Maine have these neon green stripes. That's for 2 senators who claim to be independent. Both of those senators caucus with the Democrats. One of them is Bernie Sanders, who until recently was a candidate within the Democrat Party for president. So really, Vermont should be blue and Maine should be purple. Again, balance of power shifts. The Senate was majority Democrat prior to the November 2014 elections. Question: does gerrymandering apply to the Senate? Well, if you think about it for a minute, you'll realize no, it does not. Senate elections are statewide. They're not based on districts. The state boundaries have been set for some time, so there's no room for political shenanigans drawing districts. Senate elections are statewide. Gerrymandering does not apply. Let's take a look at Senate leadership. The Vice President, currently Michael Pence, is the ceremonial leader of the Senate. This is straight out of the Constitution. The Vice President is the President of the Senate, it's called. It's an interesting role, but Mike Pence, he's pretty busy. He doesn't have time to sit around in the Senate very often. The one time that the vice president could be called into duty is if there's a tie. So if there's a vote on a law or something like that, and the Senate is split 50-50, it's possible the vice president could be called in as a tiebreaker. If you click on this link up here, you'll see the Senate website, and it'll go through the leadership of the Senate. Okay, so the current Senate leadership, we have Mitch McConnell. He is the majority leader. He's a Republican. Remember, the Republicans have the majority in the Senate. And then over here on the left, you have Chuck Schumer from New York, and he is the leader of the Democrats in the Senate. Senate leaders are also assisted by whips, so they have the same kind of assistant leadership structure as the House of Representatives does. Lo and behold, also like the House of Representatives, the Senate also works in committees, and you can click on the link above, take a look at the different committees in the Senate, and you can look at the Agriculture Committee and the Defense Committee and the Budget Committee and so on and so forth. And again, this is because we have many specialized areas of law. Our lawmakers cannot be an expert in every area, so this is very similar to the House of Representatives. There are approximately 17 committees and 70 subcommittees in the Senate. So this is where they do a lot of their work, is in committee. Okay, let's talk about the senators for Louisiana. Again, Louisiana has 2 senators, just like every other state. John Kennedy was elected in 2016. Now, what's interesting is that we did not have a senator up for re-election in 2018. Remember, elections are staggered. No state will have both senators up for election in the same year. So we had an election in 2014. We had an election in 2016 for where John Kennedy became senator. We'll talk about him in just a minute. But 2018 was an off year for the Louisiana senator. So we had no senator up for re-election in 2018. The other senator is Dr. Bill Cassidy. He was elected in 2014. And there are 2 very different stories about how they got elected. We'll start with Dr. Bill Cassidy. He is the senior senator, although neither of them are very senior. Okay, so both of the Louisiana senators are pretty new. They've only been in office 1 term. Dr. Bill Cassidy, he is up for re-election this November 2020. Okay, so talking about Bill Cassidy, the previous senator that held that spot was Mary Landrieu. Mary Landrieu had been senator for 3 terms, so 18 years, the majority of your lifetime, basically since 1997. And Mary Landrieu was a Democrat, and this was part of kind of a Republican movement where many of the rural states like Louisiana were moving more Republican. And so Dr. Bill Cassidy, who's a Republican, challenged Mary Landrieu. Very difficult to challenge an incumbent. We'll talk about this. But he did, and he actually prevailed and won the election against the incumbent, which is a very difficult thing to do. Now let's talk about John Kennedy. He had a different situation. Okay, so the senator prior to John Kennedy was a gentleman named David Vitter. David Vitter actually ran for governor. That's not unusual. Okay, so you will see politicians moving, for example, from the House to the Senate, or from the Senate to a governorship, or from the Senate, run for president, something like that. So David Vitter, the prior senator, decided to run for governor. He lost, and actually that campaign was pretty nasty. I even got some mail, some like junk mail about, David Vitter's sex scandal in Washington, blah, blah, blah. Very nasty campaign. And I guess Vitter decided that he would retire from public life. So that left his Senate seat wide open. This was a big opportunity because, again, very difficult to challenge an incumbent like Dr. Bill Cassidy did. But here is a Senate seat that's wide open. Lots and lots of politicians ran for that Senate seat. But eventually John Kennedy beat them all out. So Louisiana, we'll talk about this. Louisiana has kind of a jungle system where they jam all the candidates on the same ballot, and then they take the top 2 candidates and have a runoff, and John Kennedy won in that runoff. Keep your eye out for John Kennedy because you will see little snippets of him on the news. He's pretty funny. He has a lot of very country cornball expressions that he uses that make for good sound bites. So you will see John Kennedy on TV from time to time. I guess Dr. Cassidy, being a doctor, he's probably more cerebral. John Kennedy is an attorney, right? So he's used to, making his living by talking. And Dr. Bill Cassidy, he's probably more of a brain type. I'm guessing more of an introvert. We really don't see as much of Dr. Cassidy on TV, but you will see John Kennedy from time to time. All right, so incumbents have an advantage. We've kind of danced around this a little bit. The incumbent is the one who's already in the position. Incumbents have an advantage. It's harder to get elected than to get re-elected. Take a look at this meme. We talked about the fact that the approval rating for members of Congress is very low, in the teens, right? So here's this meme. It says 11% approval ratings, 96.4% re-elected. So it's basically begging the question, if people are so upset with Congress, why do we keep re-electing the same bozos over and over and over? And it's a little misleading because people do not approve of Congress in general, okay? But we don't vote for members of Congress in general. We vote for the representative from our district and the senators from our state. So generally, we're pretty pleased with our representative and our senators for the most part, which is why we keep re-electing them over and over. We just don't like all the other guys in Congress that the other states keep re-electing, right? But it's very interesting how difficult it is to challenge an incumbent. It's kind of like trying to get a job and they keep asking you for experience and you're like, how can I get experience if I don't have a job? And it's very similar. So let's take a look at why. Why would an incumbent have an advantage? And there's lots of reasons why. I mean, if you're an incumbent, let's say you're recognizable, you have a track record, you have experience in Congress, you've done things that you can talk about. We'll get into campaign finance as well, but it's easier to raise money when you're an incumbent. It's like a self-perpetuating cycle, that people want to donate money to the people in power, and you don't necessarily want to donate money to a challenger who's unlikely to win. People who are in Congress are already on influential committees. If you vote for a challenger, you're not really sure what committee they're going to end up on. It could be kind of luck of the draw. So there's many reasons that incumbents have an advantage. Another reason is, remember, we talked about the fact members of Congress are very accessible. and they can use their office to reach out and help voters. This is called constituency services. So if you get into a pickle with a federal bureaucracy, you can try calling your member of Congress, see if they can help you out. Even more so, you have a whole office dedicated. Basically, it's your PR team reaching out, publicizing things that happen. So you kind of have a built-in re-election team. Incumbents may be on influential committees. They may have brought benefits to their home state that people appreciate. They get more media attention and PR support. Take John Kennedy, for example. Now he's a lot more well known. Before he wasn't as well known before he became a senator. It's easier for incumbents to raise money for their election campaigns as well. Incumbents have something else which is kind of interesting. It's called the frank, F-R-A-N-K. And basically frank just means signature. And what it does is it allows members of Congress to send mail using their signature. So instead of a stamp in the upper right-hand corner, they can actually stamp their signature, and they don't have to pay to use the U.S. mail. Now, I know a lot of you guys, you're probably rolling your eyes, who uses snail mail anymore? But remember, you're not the only target audience, okay? Us old people are also target audience. We actually do still use the mail. By the way, they have free website service too on the .gov web server. But I have here in my hand an envelope that I got in the mail. It says U.S. House of Representatives, Washington, D.C., public document, official business. And then up in the upper right-hand corner where the stamp would be, if I wanted to send a letter in the mail, I would have to pay and put a stamp there, but it's a big scrawl. That scrawl is the signature of Dr. Ralph Abraham. He is the representative for the 5th District of Louisiana. So I'm opening this letter here. It's on very nice letterhead, Congress of the United States, House of Representatives, Ralph Lee Abraham. And I'm thinking, if you're a challenger, you don't get to do this, right? You don't get to have the nice official public document letterhead. Okay, when you send out spam, it looks like spam. But this is from Dr. Abraham. He says, "Dear Laura, thank you for contacting my office about Obamacare." Now, I don't want to throw shade on Dr. Abraham. He's a good dude. I don't remember contacting his office about Obamacare. Regardless, he tells me it's important to hear your views on an issue that affects every American. Then Dr. Abraham says, as a physician, I've seen the problems with Obamacare. And he goes on and he talks about the bill that Congress passed with his support, several paragraphs, basically just talking about his accomplishments and achievements that you can only have if you're an incumbent, right? The challenger would not have these kinds of accomplishments. Finally, he said, it was good to hear from you. Please feel free to contact me anytime you have an issue of concern before Congress. Remember, we talked about the fact Congress is our most accessible branch of government. Here's Dr. Abraham with his personal, I guess as personal as a form letter can be, right? His personal invitation to contact him, to visit his website, abraham.house.gov, sign up for his e-newsletter. And he finishes by saying it's an honor to serve as the United States representative for the 5th District of Louisiana. And I've gotten several letters from Dr. Abraham over the years very similar to that one. So you can see why incumbents have an advantage in elections. Okay, we've reached the end of today's lecture. Please prepare for the next one. Read Federalist Essay 62. We're going to be talking about how bills become law. So that's kind of an interesting topic. This is the same readings as last time, actually, so you get another chance. Please also read the Constitution, Article 1, Sections 2 to 3, that talk about the House of Representatives and the Senate. And the page numbers for the Accessible Federalist are there on the slide. Thanks very much. Good luck, stay healthy, and I will see you next time.